Grove, the Editor-in-Chief of Facility Executive Magazine, and this webinar is presented by Status Solutions. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, please note the control panel on your screen. This is where you can submit questions to us via the question box in that panel, and you can send these in at any time. Our speakers will address them after the presentation. Also, please note the orange arrow on the left side of that control panel. Clicking on that arrow will either expand or collapse the panel, so please be sure it is expanded so you can access the question box. And then if any time you experience a technical difficulty, send us a message also via that question box and we'll address it right away. Thank you. Now let's get started and meet your speakers for today. Brad Spicer is founder and president of SafePlans. His expertise as a safety and security consultant includes police instruction, dignitary protection, homeland security, school safety, and emergency planning and response with the advanced threat assessment training from the U.S. Secret Service and Gavin DeBecker and Associates. With a degree in criminal justice, Spicer began his career in the U.S. Army as an intelligence analyst and later served as a squad leader in Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He then spent 11 years with the Missouri State Highway Patrol, serving 5 years each on the Special Emergency Response Team and the Governor's Security Division. Your second speaker today is Amy Jeffs. She has more than 18 years of experience in the technology industry and now serves as a business and marketing consultant for Status Solutions. Before joining the company in 2006, Amy's business-to-business career included 10 years with enterprise software and IT services companies, where she helped to develop new solutions, bring them to market, and train customers to use them with the desired investment. Amy is a cum laude graduate of Auburn University with a bachelor's degree in mass communications. And now, without further ado, we'll get started, and I'll hand it over to Brad.
Thanks. Appreciate everyone attending and for Status Solutions for setting this up. Today we're going to talk about emergency. And there's a lot of elements to that, and we're going to try to hit on as many of them as we can. Really, when you think about an emergency, before you can respond to any emergency, you have to be aware that it exists. So that's situational awareness, just a proper state of mind. And we're going to touch on situational awareness again. But it's a key element when we talk about making decisions. The more aware we are of our environment, the sooner we recognize hazards, and we're better able to deal with that. For instance, I'm in Florida, with the Hurricane Joaquin. We're still not sure what it's going to do. It looks like it's going to be Category 4. The further out we can project that, the better we can make decisions on how to deal with the upcoming emergency. A lot of decision making in an emergency should rest on your emergency plans and interface with your emergency plan. Situational awareness and preparedness go hand in hand. In 2011, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security came out with a presidential policy directive that listed 5 elements of emergency preparedness: prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. And all 5 are interconnected. And the planning process is related to each of them. And we're not going to so much go into emergency planning today, but just to talk about how that relates to your ability to respond during an actual emergency. One of the most critical elements to me is prevention, that first phase. If you can imagine an emergency, just imagine a timeline, and then pick any emergency and put that right in the middle of the timeline, and that's your X. Prevention should be trying to get before X. We've got to do more things to do that. Everything to the right of the emergency, or the X, is going to be our response, and everything to the left can be prevention. Emergency management, prior to that, it was civil defense. Now even in Homeland Security, to a large part, focuses mostly on response. And response is important, but if we can get before X, we can better prevent it. Even if we're aware the emergency could occur, our response and our decision-making is easier because we're not surprised by the emergency. So when we talk about emergency planning, certainly response is important. But remember, getting before X is what's going to help us prevent that emergency, or at least mitigate it if it's something like a hurricane that we cannot prevent. Hazards preparedness. Preparedness, one, you have to understand what your hazards are. Certain areas of the world and the country right now, the hurricane's not an impact. That's not a hazard to them. And when you understand your hazards, you have to look at the resources that you have locally and externally in your communities. Then you need to train the plan and then integrate collaboration with your partners. So preparedness is critical, and having that plan is a vital element before you can make decisions. However, the plan can cover every scenario, and you really shouldn't try to cover every possible scenario. That's emergency that you just likely life or death decisions in some emergencies. The system is up here, the Observe-Orient-Decide-Act cycle, It was developed by Air Force Colonel John Boyd. He was a fighter pilot. This is often referred to as the Boyd cycle, or the OODA, which is the acronym for Observe-Orient-Decide-Act, the OODA loop. So the OODA loop is this help explain to an aerial combat to fighter pilots on how they would go through critical decision making. So just repeats. So the first element is observe. So you become aware of the situation. That's why situational awareness is so critical when we first know what's going on. So observe ties in. Certainly something. But not just see something, say something. Make sure your people understand.
Excuse me, Brad. Excuse me,
Yeah.
Brad. I'm sorry. This is Ann. I just wanted to let you know we're having a little cutting out with your audio. I didn't want you to go any further with us.
Okay.
You know, missing your information.
Sorry about that. Let me see if I can get on a different set here and maybe dial in on a different line too. Is that any better now?
Now you're clear. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay.
I just didn't want to
No,
miss out
I
on
do
your
appreciate
information.
you letting me know.
Okay. All right. Let's keep going.
I'll have another line on standby. Thanks.
Wonderful.
So the first step of Observe, Orient, Decide, Act is observe, being aware of your environment, situational awareness. So when we look at that, that ties into see something, say something, but you want to make sure your staff don't just say something. Explain to them things they should be looking for, and the something, make sure they know who they should report to. So that's a critical element when we look at the observe element, is situational awareness. Orient is the next area. This is where understanding your emergency plans and your environment, something that we call an operational environment analysis, which is just understanding your place of work. That's your operational environment. But orient yourself to the situation as best you can before you try to determine or decide your options. So orientation, the more familiar you are with your environment and your emergency plans, the faster that step goes. We look at the hurricane. If you've never contemplated before how you might respond to an emergency and didn't even know a hurricane could hit your location, it's going to take you a lot more time to determine your best course of action than a place that has a plan and understands what their vulnerabilities are related to that hazard. Decide is the third step. So you determine what's your best possible response based on what you know at the time. Don't overthink the situation. Being familiar with the situation, with your situational awareness, knowing your plans, knowing your hazard, determine what you're going to do. Training is what helps us decide in an emergency. So we've looked at the situation, we've practiced the scenario, so that way we're comfortable with making these decisions, preferably under a little bit of stress, but that's where drills, tabletop exercises, and even full-scale exercises can help us better know which elements of the plan need to be implemented. So decide is improved through training. Act is the final step. So you carry out the action to the best of your abilities based on what you know at the time. A little bit later on, we're going to talk about how stress or fear and panic, or what we call extreme survival stress, can be an impediment to putting that plan into action. So act is that final step. And then the loop repeats. So as the emergency changes, so whether it's a storm that's changing, a human-based threat that's maybe outside and now inside your facility, a hazardous materials release that you felt like you could contain by staying inside your building, as the situation changes, no matter what it is, just repeat the loop. New observation requires new orientation, a new decision, and a new action. When we look at situational awareness, which is really one of the key elements of decision-making, imagine that an active shooter had to come to one of your facilities today and you could not stop them from coming, but to observe that active shooter was there. When they were in the parking lot or the front door, well, obviously the parking lot. The sooner we can recognize a threat, the more options we have. And if you couldn't do it at the front door, you'd want to do it in the office. And the office is the hallway, and the hallway is better than the classroom. So the sooner you can recognize a situation, the more options you have. This applies to multiple hazards. This doesn't just apply to human-based threats. When we look at severe weather, we talked about the hurricane, or tsunami, or tornado. A hazardous materials release. If you didn't realize that your facility was possibly in danger of a hazardous materials release because of nearby pipelines, rail lines, highways with shipping containers, those are things that can take you longer to decide what's going on. So being aware of your environment, how close you are to the threat, your type of facility can help you make that decision whether you're better to evacuate or shelter in place. System that was developed also by the military by a Marine named Jeff Cooper is often called Cooper's color codes. And what this has to do is with your mental state of awareness. your level of situational awareness, if you will, and how ready you are mentally to respond to a threatening or emergency situation. White is the lowest level. That's where you're unprepared, unready to take action. If something happens during white, you're likely to die. Yellow is our goal. Yellow is prepared, alert, relaxed with good situational awareness. Yellow is not paranoid. It's not hypervigilance. It's just aware of your environment. You understand your baseline. You understand your hazards and what's supposed to happen throughout the day. So if something changes, you can shift to that specific alert, which is orange. In orange, you're ready to take action. And then if there is an actual emergency and it's time to act, red is action mode. That's where you're focused on the emergency at hand. Now, black is the extreme opposite of white. With black, it's system overload. You have a total breakdown of physical and mental performance, and that's where we go into what we call that extreme survival stress or panic that we'll talk about in just a little bit. Ways to decide better, for instance, for a human-based threat that can keep us out of that panic mode. The more aware we are of our environment, the better we can decide how to respond. So understanding warning signs or possible indicators, for instance, and that goes with not just weather, but with human-based threats. So a system that we call first-timer syndrome helps us kind of outline what it is that someone shows before an attack. These things is what we call pre-attack indicators or pains, and they're physical and behavioral indicators exhibited immediately at or prior to an attack. So even if you just get a few seconds warning before an attack, that can help you better decide what to do. Any situational awareness is better than no situational awareness. So a few seconds gain can save lives. When we look at physical pre-attack indicators or pains, these are certainly things that can be, that occur hundreds of times throughout the day, but it's your intuition and your situational awareness that are putting these together in context of the situation that might help you realize that you have a decision to make regarding a human-based threat. So it's that situational awareness, your full of training, and your ability to act are going to help you decide faster in that life or death situation. So you can see the list of physical pre-attack indicators that can show that someone might be getting ready to carry out an attack. Behavioral pre-attack indicators or pains, minimizing door-to-door distances. So when we look at not so recent, coming up on 2 years in December, attack at Sandy Hook Elementary School. The killer parked his vehicle in a no parking zone in front of the school. We're not suggesting in any way that warrants an automatic 911 call or building-wide alert, but if you don't have the situational awareness to at least realize someone parking in a no parking zone is not desired behavior, you're not going to be paying attention when the killer goes to the back of the vehicle and removes a rifle. So it's not the parking lot, it's the front door when you realize the threat. So it's being aware of your environment. So if you're aware of your environment, yellow, just prepared, alert, relaxed. Someone is parked in a no parking zone, you've gone to level orange. I'm looking at this to figure out more information. You see the parent retrieve a backpack and walk hurriedly into school because their child forgot it. You're back to yellow. You don't have to overreact. You don't have to go into red, but you do have to at least acknowledge that there's been a change of the baseline, which was yellow. And you can see the other examples of pre-attack behavioral indicators that are up there. Those are all part of that observe. When we look at orient, that's that operational environment analysis. The more familiar you are with your emergency plan and your location will help you orient faster. So you can orient faster through emergency notifications and technology solutions, understanding your evacuation routes, understanding your severe weather shelter areas. We have a basic floor plan, something that I had learned through the Secret Service doing many different types of dignitary protection advances, was just assigning a very basic tactical grid to floor plans or area maps. That way we're able to orient faster. If you were inside that building and didn't know the building well and someone said go to the north end of the hallway, you might not know what they're talking about. North, which hallway? But if someone said go to D1, you're immediately able to get there. So sometimes technology and tools can help us orient faster. Being aware of your emergency plan and your location help you to orient faster. Operational environment analysis, when we look at something like an active shooter situation, and this certainly applies to other things like severe weather and fire evacuations, but in an active shooter, that operational environment analysis, understanding your environment, can help you. No one can pre-plan exactly how your facility should respond to an active shooter event. The response is dependent upon two things: the level of contact with the bat, which is either direct or indirect, and your location. Location includes responsibilities and your ability to run, hide, or as a last resort fight. That's going to change throughout the building. So if a shooter is in a front office area, they're going to have a different response than perhaps someone on a different floor that's in an administrative office. So that location is different. So contact plus location equals response. This operational environment analysis helps you orient faster to your response by understanding where you're at. So in your office, understanding your primary exit, secondary exit, nearest securable location. So if you had to run, how could you get out of there? Could you get out a ground floor window? Is it a ground floor window? Can the window be open? Those are all things that help you decide if you can run from that location. We talk about hide. Can the location you work in be secured? If it's an open office plan with cubicles, it cannot be secured likely. If it's a glass interior wall, it probably cannot be secured. What's the locking mechanism? Do you have to go out into the hallway with the vision panel? The door swing, if it opens in, you can probably barricade it. If it opens out, tie it off. And then as a last resort to fight, improvised weapons, if you had to use them, what is available. Decide. So you've gone through observe, orient, decide, and act. Training will expedite the decision-making by reinforcing concepts in the emergency plan. You have to train the plan. So training the plan is what helps us go through. So being aware of your emergency plan, training staff will help them decide a lot better. And act is the last step in the loop. The more stressful the incident, the more challenging it can be to implement your plan. So that's what we're going to talk about, this extreme survival stress, or sometimes what's called as the body's fight or flight response. So training, stress inoculation, and proper breathing are all tools that can help you overcome this extreme survival stress. When we talk about extreme survival stress, the body cannot go where the mind has not been. It's been called the universal human phobia. We're supposed to be afraid of someone trying to hurt us. We're supposed to be afraid of life or death emergencies, such as a fire or severe weather. When this happens, our body can go into what we call fight or flight syndrome. Fight or flight, while it was designed to help us, emergencies are more complicated than simply just running or fighting back against an attacker. So when we look at this fight or flight syndrome, several things happen. So when you observe a threat to your survival, it doesn't have to be a human-based threat. It can be severe weather, it can be a natural disaster, but it's a threat to your survival. The brain processes the threat, and that sounds an alarm, which starts this physiological process. Your pituitary gland secretes a hormone that causes the release of adrenaline and cortisol, and that causes some symptoms in our body, which again were designed to make us run faster or be stronger in a fight, but it can have side effects that are very counterproductive to us in an emergency situation. So we have to train to overcome the fight or flight syndrome, or this extreme survival threat. When we are afraid, the body induces what's typically called that fight or flight syndrome. It was designed to help us flee from danger, but can work against us in an emergency situation. The physiological symptoms, increased heart rate, the thyroid gland increases the metabolism, the adrenaline fills the blood. All these things are working against us, and it's working against our brain. So when we look at what happens in our brain, the midbrain actually starts to take over. That's where these actions are taking place in the hippocampus, in the amygdala, in the hypothalamus, and all these things are taking place to secrete these hormones, and our forebrain is shutting down, and our forebrain is what we want in charge of an emergency. So when we start to go through this extreme survival stress, and these symptoms kick in, they can impact us. So certain symptoms of extreme survival stress include irrational thinking and poor decision making. Obviously, that can be very difficult in an emergency situation, especially if you're a leader in a facility. You've got to be able to make those decisions. So proper training can keep us out of extreme survival stress, and the OODA, Observe-Orient-Decide-Act, can be a fallback position to help us understand the situation and determine our best course of action. Freezing and slow time are other symptoms of extreme survival stress. These symptoms, freezing can be the condition black, where our body goes into system overload. Slow time can actually process things a little differently, so we have the appearance that things have slowed down. Both of those can be problematic. If the emergency starts to slow down and you feel that you have locked up, you actually might stop. So you should realize that if you are sensing things are moving slower in an emergency, it's your body going into that extreme survival stress. If you have frozen up, realize that you can come out of that. Neither of these are permanent afflictions. We can overcome them. Vasoconstriction is another symptom of extreme survival stress. This happens when our blood vessels narrow. The theory is that our body is pulling blood into our core to help us survive. So we need the blood in our lungs to get more oxygen to our muscles. We don't need blood in our periphery because we don't need fine motor skills if it's in fight or flight syndrome. The problem with that is when muscles do not have blood in them, they don't function well. So when we look at things like being able to dial a phone, that's where we'll get trembling in our hands. So vasoconstriction is certainly a problem with the ability to do things like fine motor skills, complex motor skills, dial a phone, enter in a code for a door to unlock or lock, use a key. So those are challenges. Auditory exclusion is another symptom of extreme survival stress. This can result in hearing loss. Your brain can actually shut off hearing faster than the speed of sound. So the problem with that is if you're making intercom announcements or intercom announcements are being made, you might not hear them. The theory behind it is that under fight or flight syndrome, if we're running or fighting, hearing was not a necessary bodily function, so the midbrain is shutting that down so it can focus strictly on things we need to survive. One of the most dangerous symptoms of extreme survival stress is submissive behavior. What you see here is from a shooting in 2012 in Oakland, where the killer went in and told people, get in the line, I'm going to kill you all. And several people got in the line and were murdered. When it's difficult for us to make decisions, when we're really scared, we're more likely to follow commands. So submissive behavior is a symptom of extreme survival stress. The midbrain is not equipped to make decisions. So when we're really scared and we're told something to do, we're more likely to do it, even if it's not in our own best interest. And these mass killings, passive targets are easy victims. We need to be able to make decisions. You can see in law enforcement, the hit ratio is around 12 to 18% in law enforcement-related shootings. But the shooter hit rates are significantly higher. It's not because of skill or marksmanship. It's because of the passive response, because of people hiding under tables or sitting against the floor, or as what happened in Oakland, people being willing to line up against a wall. So being able to think rationally helps us move away from the bad guy and make it less likely we get hurt. Under extreme survival stress, it's also difficult to communicate and speak. It's because of the increased heart rate. The heart rate is pumping faster to keep more oxygen and blood in the body, so the heart's working harder, and we get dry mouth. This is one of the areas where the midbrain has shut down a lot of digestive functions, so the stomach's working differently and it doesn't need the saliva that we typically have to talk. So those are things that can impact our ability to speak. Perseveration is the irrational repetition of a process or behavior. We get stuck in our habits because we aren't able to think outside the box during an emergency. So the more scared we are, the more extreme survival stress kicks in, the more likely we're to fall back on bad habits. That's why it's really important in training we develop good habits. For instance, if your phone system requires you to dial a 9 to obtain an outside line, in an emergency, you would need to dial 911. But if you haven't practiced that, you're probably just going to dial 911. The result will not get you emergency services. That will just increase your panic, and you'll just dial 911 again. So it's very difficult for us to think outside the box. Very little innovative thinking occurs under what we call combat or emergency conditions. When we talk about preventing extreme survival stress, we can prevent ourselves from going into it. This will help us make better decisions in an emergency. Proper training allows our brain to associate the emergency with the successful response. This is beneficial in several levels. The hippocampus links training in the emergency and places this into long-term memory. I've done a drill for this emergency. I responded better and well to that emergency. Now your brain remembers what to do. This associated memory can inhibit the sounding of the fight or flight alarm when a real emergency occurs. You know what to do. That's why people don't go into panic when they've trained for that emergency. The knowledge of during and after the emergency. So there's less worry, we have a better response, and if we're prepared before an incident, we're less likely to have people suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. So preventing extreme survival stress requires training. If extreme stress happens, it can be overcome, and it's literally through taking breaths. There's several different reasons for this, but basically the midbrain, which is controlling fight or flight, taking over the forebrain, which controls higher thought processes. A controlled breathing can interrupt the midbrain's control, allowing you to overcome extreme survival stress. The reason blinking is there, so blinking and breathing are two things that are controlled by your midbrain without conscious thought, but you can also do it any time. Under extreme survival stress, the midbrain is telling the lungs to bring in more oxygen to accommodate fight or flight. You can interrupt this by exaggerating your breathing cycle. So the technical term is called autogenic breathing. Sometimes it's called combat breathing or tactical breathing. It can control your fear and stress by limiting the role of the body's sympathetic nervous system, that midbrain. The sympathetic nervous system controls fight or flight. So the process of the breathing exercise is breathe through your nose for 4 counts. Hold that for 4 counts. Exhale through your mouth for 4 counts. And then hold empty for 4 counts. Repeat this process. Even if you cannot go through this full 4-count breathing, just the simple thought of reminding your body how to breathe interrupts that midbrain control and that extreme survival stress and allows you to focus on something like the OODA loop, Observe-Orient-Decide-Act. It gives you something to focus on to get that forebrain back engaged so you can make rational decisions under stress in an emergency. So in summary, before I turn it over to Amy, remember, getting before X is a key in emergency prevention and response. So if there's an emergency, think of things you can do to get before that emergency, and prevention is the key. Your emergency plans need to be all hazards. They should account for all different areas, but no plan can account for every emergency. So the OODA loop, that Observe-Orient-Decide-Act, that loop is your best way to respond in an emergency. Having a plan, training the plan, and relying on your training will keep you out of fight or flight or extreme survival stress. If you do happen to go into extreme survival stress, remember it's not permanent. Don't panic. Just take a breath, take a couple, and you can work your way out of it. I will certainly be around for questions, and at this point, we're going to turn it back over to Amy.
Thanks, Brad. Brad always gives a great presentation, so I hope that everybody was able to take something away from what Brad has shared with us today. I kind of want to take it from here and talk a little bit more about situational awareness and in particular technology and how technology can be part of the broader strategy. As Brad described in the observe phase of the OODA loop principles that he discussed, realizing the power of situational awareness is important, and it's vital to the risk mitigation process. Obviously, situational awareness, the way that we define it, is having the information that can then turn into the knowledge that you need in order to be able to react and respond in a situation. And, you know, as Brad described all hazards, that's important. It can be something as routine as, you know, the air conditioning going out, a leak in the bathroom of a facility, a weather emergency, as we have one pending, as Brad was talking about earlier, a fire, or something as extreme and rare as an armed intruder or gas leak or explosion. But regardless of the situation, we need to be aware of what's going on. And that's really what we want to impart upon everybody today is you got to have the information so that you're able to respond accordingly. And we want to be able to reduce the severity of any type of incident and primarily the impact that it has on people, the property in which the incident is occurring, and obviously any business operations that the organization is performing. Time is always of the essence, and really having situational awareness, having that knowledge, being able to observe and understand what's going on so that you can prepare accordingly, really does create time, the time that you would need to be able to prevent something from happening or to be able to respond to something as it unfolds. As Brad also described, making observations and being aware are only part of the equation. This is you know, there's many components to this and processes here, but situational awareness is very powerful. And being able to act and being able to be equipped to do so, training is a big piece of that. And as Brad shared, you know, that there is a big component there in terms of being able to. I'm going to make sure everybody is able to see my slides here. There we go. And so being able to act is important. So being able to take that training that you've been able to observe, that you've been able to learn so that you can act in an emergency, but knowing that those smallest observations can help mitigate risk. And so the way that we look at it is being able to apply technology. We all use devices. We are all in a mobile society. We all have screens, whether we're at a desk, whether we're mobile employees, whether we're around a large area campus or a single building facility. There is communication devices and tools that we have that are available to us. What is important, Brad brought up a really important concept of redundancy. The way that we all learn differently, we all communicate differently, we all have our preferences, but at the end of the day, if we're acting in an emergency type situation, being able to get information as many ways as possible is so important. So if you look at our graphic here on your screen, having really a framework of technology or software that allows you to look at this overall concept of situational awareness and kind of from a best practices perspective, be able to read about an event, read that something's going on, being able to hear the information, whether it's via phone or whether it's via PA system, to be able to actually see what's going on, be able to utilize video surveillance, be able to see if a particular exit or area of the building is blocked. All of this so that you're able to do something about it, so that you're able to act with the best baseline of information and knowledge. And of course, after the fact, it's also very important to be able to analyze the situation. What happened? Why did it happen? Can we potentially prevent it from happening again? We go back and observe the process all over again and hope that we can minimize the impact in the future. We'll probably change our protocols and processes and how we react and revisit our training and look again at that operational environment analysis that Brad discussed, and because we want to be able to improve those processes. So not only being able to act and have the information at the time of an incident, but then being able to go back and analyze it from a reporting perspective afterwards is important as well. What we're trying to do at the end of the day is we want to provide protections. We want to prevent things from happening, but we want to protect against it as well. And so all of the facilities and organizations that are on our call today vary. We have education facilities and hospitality and manufacturing organizations and retail and healthcare. But at the end of the day, you all have people, you all have property that you're trying to protect, you're trying to run some sort of a business, and there are individuals who will be inconvenienced or discomforted based on something happening, an event happening. Again, it could be, very mundane, or it could be a critical emergency situation. But regardless, that's our goal, is to provide information so that you can prevent loss, and to be able to do that in a way that impacts core areas of any type of business. Situational awareness is a big concept and something that we're here a lot about. But it really boils down to what we just talked about, prevention, integration, automating processes, automating technology, facility from being reactionary and siloed to being more strategic and holistic in terms of emergency communication and response. We see this really in 4 key areas: life safety, which we've talked a lot about today, security, environmental monitoring, and mass notification. So these are all areas where technology could be applied, where processes, training, protocols can be applied so that we can better understand how to act in the future. So we take this outcome, what we're trying to get to, this outcome of being aware, and really, how do you do that? How do you take that information that's available, and how do we get that information out? How do we really look at life safety, security, environmental monitoring? How do we look at these large campuses, these large enterprises that we're responsible for protecting? And then how do we really take technology and apply that? And the way that we do it at Status Solutions is we look at 3 functional areas, because your goal really is to integrate your current systems and be able to automate them in order to create this overall situational awareness within your organization. So you all have existing alarming systems in some way, shape, or form, whether they're ingress or egress systems, whether it's video surveillance, whether it's fire, whether it is carbon monoxide. You have various alarming systems throughout your facility, motion, temperature. And the goal is to be able to monitor that, to integrate to that, to take those systems and to make them more intelligent by creating kind of a framework, if you will, amongst all of those systems and be able to monitor that. Now, it's great to have that information, but then what do you do with it? Well, you want to be able to alert. You want to be able to let people know what's going on when it's going on, and the best way to communicate with those individuals, like we talked about before, whether that is via a smartphone, landline, a desktop computer, handheld radios, LED displays, PA systems. Certain individuals will need to be alerted in a certain manner. So being able to do that. Not everybody needs to know everything in a certain incident either. It really depends on what it is. So being able to be flexible and escalating who needs to know what when. And again, that really depends on the type of incident, but then goes back to those systems that are being monitored. And I can't emphasize enough the reporting aspect of this, being able to capture those events, being able to understand how much time it took, who were the notified parties, what type of alert confirmations did we receive, and have that information. Because not only is that information important during an incident, but obviously it's important afterwards. And, you know, to Brad's point, being able to take it and then learn from it, from things that happen on a daily basis, and then be able to reapply it. Because at the end of the day, we want organizations to be prepared, to be aware, so that they can take action, whatever action it is necessary to mitigate risk. Because we truly believe that that's the right thing to do. That's the right way to prepare. The good news is that today's devices and networks are much smarter, and so putting the right type of software and the right type of protocols, as well as training on top of that, is easier today than it's ever been before. It's more cost effective to be able to do that as well, by being able to take existing systems and to integrate those as opposed to replacing them, so that you really can automate this emergency notification process more. You know, SafePlans and Status Solutions are two organizations that were really founded and created to help people. That is why they were put in place, both from a training and emergency response and planning perspective, and a technology emergency response perspective. And so we hope we were able to start that process today. That was my goal, and I know it's Brad's as well, is that we were able to get you thinking, give you some ideas and some things to think about, and go back to your teams internally and to have some discussions that will really prompt your decision-making processes internally. So we hope we were able to start that process for you today. And I'll hand it back over to you, and hopefully we'll have some good questions from folks. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Amy, and thank you, Brad. We will do our Q&A now. Amy, I'm going to kind of piggyback on something you had been talking about right toward the end of your presentation. Technology, the use of technology for improving emergency preparedness, emergency response, and ultimately situational awareness, as we're talking about here. So Amy or Brad, I'll put this out to you. What are your recommendations for improving situational awareness from a technology standpoint? Amy, you had mentioned briefly integrating current systems into current alarm systems, which is interesting. And also, I guess, what type of information will be able to be dovetailed with technology tools?
I can start that. You know, it depends on the environment, obviously, and what information needs to be displayed. You know, in let's take the event of a fire. You know, obviously you need to know there is a fire. You need to know where that fire is located. The more intelligent information you can provide, the better. Being able to be able to visually see, as I said before, utilize video paging, and be able to utilize current systems that you already have in place from a video surveillance perspective, and then be able to pop screens with that information. So whether you're in an environment where there are desktop computers, where you can pop the information from a screen pop perspective to a desktop, whether you've got mobile employees that do have some type of handheld device, and whether that needs to be a visual indication, whether that needs to be delivered via audio, whether it needs to be a phone call, whether it needs to go over the PA system. So if it's fire related, obviously you're going to need to give some evacuation information. If it is, another type of environmental, maybe there's refrigeration unit in a particular building and that temperature has gone above a specific threshold and you're storing food, and somebody needs to be notified of that, probably somebody in maintenance or facilities, and they will be able to be alerted to that so that we could prevent loss, in terms of monetary loss in that perspective. But there's a variety of different applications for it, but at the end of the day, you just want to be able to get information to the right people at the right time.
Okay, and thank you. Okay, and another question to the technical side of this is for the types of enterprise-wide scenarios we're talking about, what kind of networks, building networks or building system networks, do these situational awareness technologies work on? What type of infrastructure might need to be in place or put into place?
Again, it depends on the applications that you're looking for. We firmly believe that life safety needs its own network. And so to be able to, in a mobile duress type situation where you have individuals who would need to be notified or to notify someone in the event of a mobile duress, whether that's in a hotel, whether that's in a school. So having a dedicated network that would be for life safety, obviously is a recommendation that we make at Status Solutions. Now, obviously, there are other networks that can be leveraged, whether those are Wi-Fi networks, whether they're cellular networks, that can be leveraged as well, depending on the type of information that needs to be conveyed and where it needs to be conveyed and to whom, via what device, if they're on-premise versus off-premise. But the goal is to really look at the environment. I like to borrow Brad's terminology from time to time of the operational environment analysis, and we look at it a little bit different, but understanding what the environment is, what the applications are you're looking to do, and then we will leverage the networks that we can that are already in place, and then if we need to do dedicated networks, we can do that as well. But it really does, I hate to say it, but it really does depend on the facility.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amy. And then also, we have another question about training and prevention strategies, tools for before that X, as Brad had mentioned, the X before the incident occurs. In terms of the technologies that are available, what type of, I guess you had mentioned some alerting protocols, but what types of advantages or benefits are there with that technology in terms of prevention strategies, knowing ahead of time what's going on, before your occupants are impacted, hopefully? What kind of ways can technology be used for the prevention side of that?
Sure, this is Brad. There's a couple of different ways. One, we use technology when we do security and vulnerability assessments at a building to determine what physical security roles are needed, where deficiencies might be. So we use a mobile app that we've developed for that to help identify risks ahead of time so that we can address them or prevent them, or at least make sure the building occupants are aware of them should something occur. And then another way technology can be used is online training. It's very difficult to get staff together, especially when facilities deal with multiple shifts, hospitality industry especially, to be able to provide online training to staff so they understand what their roles and responsibilities are. And that responsibility is also part of that prevention, so that it can tie into that see something, say something campaign that is not just saying, hey, wait for the emergency, but if you see something we can do to be proactive, here's what you do about it, and let them know what to do. So those are just some ways that we leverage technology on the prevention side of things.
Thank you. Okay, and then switching gears a little bit, we have a question about SARA reporting. What is SARA in terms of the legislation there? What is that?
I'm assuming that question is referring to the situational awareness response assistant, which is the core alerting engine that Status Solutions sells and supports. I'm assuming that's the question. But yes, that's the core alerting engine when we talk about being able to monitor facilities, being able to alert as well as being able to report. Again, that's the situational awareness and response assistant. So that's the technology that we implement to be able to achieve that.
Great. And how can we learn more on that? Is there more on your website, the Status Solutions website, or what would be the best way to?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. There is. I believe that we have our contact information up as well, so there's definitely more information there, as well as some white papers and things from an application perspective.
Okay, wonderful. And I do want to get back to that training thing, the training aspect one more time, because we have another question there, which obviously that is an important aspect. Specifically, the question is, how can I incorporate this type of training better into a personal care home? I'm not sure if that's an assisted living or a nursing care type of home, as far as my role as an administrator and to my staff.
Sure, this is Brad. Well, one, what we want to make sure in training is that we're going to train the plan. So make sure you've got a quality emergency plan for your facility that addresses your local hazards, your local resources, and then look at it from a standpoint of what the different responsibilities are. So, role-based training is really important so that people are engaged. Once again, online training is an effective way to do that if there's a course available or you can engage someone to make it. Tabletop exercises are always great. Pick a scenario and test the plan. An untrained, untested plan is just a theory. So in a staff meeting, if you have a question about how you would deal with maybe an evacuation event or how you would notify people of an emergency, sit down with a group and tabletop it. So, bring up the question and just kind of walk through it. And then what your responses are, do you determine what your best response is? Make sure that if it's not in the plan, that you update your plan and then continue to go through that. So training is really, a critical issue, but it doesn't have to be overly complicated. Oftentimes people that are experts in their profession, but because emergency management really wasn't in their curriculum when they studied, they're a little intimidated by a tabletop. So certainly, people can help with that, but, just sit down and talk about it, and it's okay to fail in training. Your training shouldn't be designed to make you fail, but if you notice in training that your plan has a failure point, that's when we want to find out. So it's okay if we fail in training. Don't be afraid to test things.
Thank you, Brad. Okay, and this is one that might be toward your expertise, Brad, as well as Amy's perhaps. It's about the hearing being turned off, quote unquote, in reaction to an emergency situation. So if the hearing is turned off during an emergency, when a person's system begins to overload, our question is, how effective are mass notification systems in these situations? This facility manager has, they're set to repeat the message several times with slightly different wording and information in hopes of giving occupants opportunity to gradually allow the information to penetrate their hearing. So what's your thought on that process?
Sure. It sounds like they've really thought through that they've changed their message. Realize in a large facility, whether it's a healthcare complex, a hotel, people are going to have different experiences. If there's a mass emergency, maybe there's a fire, explosion, a shooter in the lobby area, okay, those people are very likely to experience extreme survival stress, and mass notification might not be as useful to those people, but they're already experiencing the emergency. But the people on the other levels, the other buildings, the other wings of the facility, they aren't going to know what's going on. So they won't be experiencing that extreme survival stress. So mass notification still has a very critical role. The people that are experiencing extreme survival stress are likely to be the ones that are in direct contact with the emergency, with the bad thing that's going on. So that mass notification system probably wasn't geared towards them anyway. But it's great that they're thinking through it. Repeating the message is important. And law enforcement, we train officers because you need to realize the person you're arresting or trying to arrest also might be experiencing extreme survival stress. We say, repeat verbal commands. So say it over and over in the hopes it does get through. So it sounds like whoever had submitted that has really given that some thought, and that's great.
Thank you. Okay, and Brad, I do want to go back to, we had an inquiry about, a few inquiries about the OODA loop, from what I understand, Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. Can you just comment a little bit more on that, or maybe revisit it in terms of how this, how facility leaders can use that framework, as they're planning? Maybe just kind of revisit that.
Sure. I will bring that back up. Give me just a second, or go ahead and get that brought back up there.
Sure, thank you.
So when we look at the OODA loop, let me apologize. I'm just going to kind of scroll through. I think that'll be my fastest way to get there. So Observe-Orient-Decide-Act is the loop process when we go through an emergency. And what we want to look at on the OODA loop is making sure that you can incorporate that into your training. So even with, like, say, a tabletop exercise, and the situation that you want to test is a severe weather notification. So that's your observation. How are you going to get that information? Weather monitoring, alarms, notification systems. Then you would orient yourself to the emergency. So, okay, so we're going to incorporate this in our training. What's our plan say? So we have a tornado warning. What's the facility? What's the type of day? What activities would likely be going on at that type of day? If you have outdoor activities, where would they be? Would you cancel them? Could you notify people on their way in using that mass notification system to stop them from coming? And then decide, what's our best course of action? And then you would carry that out. And then during that action, you would talk about in your training, how would we communicate this to people? Who would be responsible for what? What if they're not here? And just look for failure points. So the Observe-Orient-Decide-Act, the OODA loop, is really just an effective way to present emergency information. And it really is the process your brain goes through when it's making a decision. So when we do our tabletop exercises, a lot of online courses, we incorporate the OODA loop into that. So when a new scenario is presented, that's through the observation. Orient yourself to your options, decide, and act. So thanks.
Thank you. And actually, Brad, I did want to follow up on that in terms of training seems to be coming up a lot, and also, mentioning some, I guess, with your expertise, I'd like to ask you, what are some common, if you can, I know every scenario has its own distinct features, but what are some common failure points in training that maybe you've seen in your work where, you might lead with our facility leaders with here that that either they might run into or just to watch out for? What are some of those common missing links?
Sure. I guess one is they're too dependent upon a top-down infrastructure for the initial response to an emergency. We develop our plans with the theory that everything is going to happen in the best possible time with the best possible people there. And so we're dependent upon this top-down notification in our planning process that, well, it'll happen here, and the leader of the facility will make the determination, and they'll know what to do, and they probably will know what to do. But inevitably, that person isn't there when the emergency happens, and so it creates a failure point. And so, the dependency on, top-down notification, that just doesn't always happen. And then also the failure points vary, and it's hazard specific. But very, very few failure points cannot be determined through training. So if you're willing to sit down, do a tabletop exercise, talk to your staff about it, those failure points can be determined. A failure point that's relevant to a hotel being able to notify guests, would be different than a manufacturing facility. So they're unique to the facility, but the tabletop exercise really should be designed to help make sure those failure points are noticed before an actual emergency.
Thank you. And we have time for about one more question. I did want to bring up the fact about working with first responders, police departments, fire departments, other agencies that are certainly involved in the different scenarios that facilities face. So, Brad or Amy, can you comment on, is there a way to improve or enhance the relationship with first responders in terms of mitigating harm during an emergency? And also, focusing on the topic we have here, what are some ways that technology can bridge that gap also?
Amy, do you want to go ahead, or do you want me to take
I was
that?
about to say, you want me to start? I'll start, Brad, and then you chime in. Obviously, involving law enforcement and working with them as part of your processes, and I'm sure Brad will touch on that as well. From a technology perspective, you need to do that as well, because they're obviously going to be part of your your response process and how you get them the information, first responders, and get them the information they need as well. Knowing that you're going to need to do some, we often say the first responders are those that are in the building, and the staff that are, and the people that are in the building. And so obviously getting them the information, but then also letting law enforcement know what has been done, what information has been shared. So including them in that process, and technology allows you with an escalation path and redundant forms of communication to be able to get them in the loop. But I think it's important that relationship be established, and that they, are involved in kind of the protocol and planning phase, so that in the event of emergency, they are familiar with your environment as well. Brad, do you have anything else you'd add to that?
I would just say that, Amy made great points, and the building really is the true first responder. But interfacing with your local public safety agencies, there's a cliche in emergency management that, the emergency is not the time to exchange business cards. So if you're doing that tabletop exercise, invite them in. As we're talking this, I try to silence all my devices, but been notified by our staff there's been a very serious shooting at Oregon State University with multiple fatalities. So that collaboration, it's more than just human-based threats, but to realize that, emergencies happen, and reach out to your local experts as you develop these plans and training programs so that they can help you. So that's a great question that you ended on there. Make sure you do reach out to them, and they'd be more than happy to attend a tabletop exercise. We do things that share like floor plans and video with them, but get them on board and work with your local people so they can respond more effectively.
Thank you, Brad. Actually, I have one more question. And actually, I'm sorry to hear the news you just shared there, Brad, and it's related to an active shooter situation, this last question. So our attendee is asking, what would you suggest for an active shooter situation in a large corporate building that has glass exterior windows, glass office and conference room, where there's no real place to hide? Any thoughts?
Yeah, sure, and it's each one is unique, but the options are run, hide, fight. So what we say is you run when you have direct contact, which would mean shared space with the attacker, cannot secure your location, which is what you're talking about there with the glass, or you have a clear path of escape. So direct contact, can't secure your location, clear path of escape, run. You would only hide or deny access when you have indirect contact, meaning the shooter's not there with you. You wouldn't want to barricade a shooter in your area. And you can secure your location. You can't secure glass unless you go to the expense of adding in some laminate that makes the glass bullet resistant. And then fight is that last resort, always the last resort. When you cannot run, there's no path of escape. You have direct contact. They're right there with you, and you're afraid for your life. But it sounds like in that situation, run is the general best course of action. And while it's not realistic that everyone can run simultaneously, the reality comes down to in an active shooter situation, a moving target is much harder to hit. So we'll see. It's mitigation. People would still likely be hurt, but we'll see fewer people shot, and out of those people that are shot, we'll see fewer fatal rounds until law enforcement can get there and resolve the situation.
Thank you, Brad. Okay, well, it looks like we are out of time. So thank you both of you for your presentation and your additional information. We appreciate it. And thanks to all our attendees today, and of course, Status Solutions for sponsoring the webinar. A recording of the webinar will be available online at facilityexecutive.com, as well as on the Status Solutions website, which is statussolutions.com. So thank you for joining us, and have a good day. Bye-bye.